In the 1990s, the underworld was almost uncontrolled. A car bombing or a drive-by shooting was near enough a daily occurrence at the worst moments. But nonetheless, the state is a lot more capable. But something a bit like that, certainly something that is much more unruly and violent, they're clearly aware that there's going to be a problem. They're not really able to properly prepare. There's always the temptation to use past models to explain the future, and the classic one for Russia is the so-called wild 90s, in which, frankly, the underworld was almost uncontrolled. I remember just from my own times in Russia in that miserable decade, when in Moscow, frankly, a car bombing or a drive-by shooting was near enough a daily occurrence at the worst moments. I don't actually think that Russia is going to slide all the way back to that, because in the 1990s, it also followed what was in effect state collapse under Gorbachev's reform program and the sundering of the Soviet Union. Actually, although the state is under pressure, we see, for example, that the police are anything from 20 to 25% under strength at the moment, but nonetheless, the state is a lot more capable. And therefore, as I say, I think we won't see anything quite like that, but something a bit like that, certainly something that is much more unruly and violent than we've seen in the past. I think that, sadly, is almost inevitable. And from the point of view of the Russian state, one of the tragedies actually here is a tragedy of leadership. What we see is that Vladimir Putin does not really like tough decisions. And what we're getting is almost like a parallel of what happened with the COVID-19 epidemic, in which he recognized it was a problem, but then just simply withdrew and dumped dealing with the problem on his prime minister, on the mayor of Moscow, and other regional governors, some of whom handled it well, some of whom handled it catastrophically badly. If you look at the discussions, for example, within the specialist police press, they're clearly aware that there's going to be a problem. Likewise, if you look, for example, at the discussions within health professionals, who are also aware that there's not just physical but psychosocial problems going to be facing them. But without a steer from the very top, they don't have resources, they don't have a national strategy, they're not really able to properly prepare. That is what Russia needs in order to try and mitigate as far as possible the impact of the returning veterans.